Hi, friends. I'm so glad you could be with me today as we're in God's Word in our Unfolding the Word series. We're in the midst of an extended study of Daniel, the first 6 chapters of Daniel. Over the last number of days, I've been setting the groundwork for it by giving you some biblical history so that you see the context into which this book situates itself. Today, I want to begin reading in chapter 1 and verse 3 and read on through verse 7. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youth without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. And among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names, and Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. Well, I'm not going to spend much time on the context of this because we've been setting the stage for it over these last couple of days. Daniel takes place in the final years of the southern kingdom of Judah. He is taken off at 605 BC as part of the initial defeat of Judah as Nebuchadnezzar brought his armies in, part of God's disciplinary hand on the rebels against him within the Jewish state. One of the results of that period of time was the determination of a brain drain, in a way, leadership drain, in which the Babylonians would take away all the most gifted young people to indoctrinate them and to train them and teach them. And Daniel was one of those people, along with his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now today, we've been talking a lot about that. Now today, I want to talk about this dramatic shift that occurred in Daniel's life from the relatively privileged position he was in prior to the defeat of Judah. He was part of the nobility, would have been wealthy, would have been elite. And how he shifted from that into a slave, into being ripped out of his homeland. We're going to examine that together because I want to look at some of the faith testers that God permitted to happen in Daniel's life and also in the life of his friends. And we'll look at those together and then start to see how God resolved these faith testers and how Daniel responded to them. Now, the first of these I've read to you and I've talked already about, and that is that Daniel was forcibly taken from his family and his home. He was part of that initial group who were ripped away from their homes and then taken to Babylon. Now, what does that mean in practice? It means Daniel, a 12 to 15-year-old young teenager, was overnight in a place where all of the security of being in his home, being in his family, loved by parents, all of that security was ripped away. No more in his life would he understand and experience the unconditional sort of acceptance that a family provides. We'll put it in contemporary terms. Daniel overnight lost the hugs. That change was that dramatic for him. And part of that also included the fact he lost the protection that his parents would have shown over his life. We don't know much about his parents, but we know this. They were Jews, they were leaders. There would have been a protective hand over Daniel to protect him from abuse, to protect him against the intrigues of human beings. Overnight, all of that changed. And now there was no one to watch out for the exploiters, no one to protect him from the abusers of his life. Forcibly taken from his home, never to return. That is the Daniel that we are studying. Now here's my question to you. Think of yourself in the 12 to 15 age category. How would you have handled a trauma like that, where you were forcibly ripped away from your family, ripped out of your home, ripped out of your region? How would you have handled it? Could you, as we discovered Daniel did, could you continue to trust a God who would permit that for your life? Would you continue to determine to follow that God, even though you went through this terrible tragedy? That is the reality of Daniel. Remarkable, isn't it? He was not someone caught up with the idea that, well, I'm going to negotiate with God. If he makes my life good, I'll follow him. If he doesn't, then I turn my back. Oh, no. He followed God no matter what. So the first of these faith testers was, how am I going to respond to being forcefully taken from my family and home? Second, and related to that, a faith tester was this. He was forcefully resettled into far foreign land. He now was exiled. I was thinking of today's world. That terminology has a lot of pertinence. The UN estimates that there's probably 46 million people in the world today who are refugees of one sort or another out of their home area and their home itself. Daniel overnight moves from being part of the elite, part of the nobility, privileged position, into refugee status. But even more than that, controlled, enslaved refugee. And he spent the rest of his life exiled from his homeland, exiled from his people. Daniel, ages 12 to 15 somewhere, lost his culture. He lost the culture of his country, and he lost the culture of his childhood and his family. He now is forcefully resettled in an area with a different culture, a different language, and he's in a different position in society. He was part of the nobility and elite, possibly the royal families. Now he's a slave. No rights, no prospects. Now here's my question. How would you have handled a trauma like that in your young teenage years? Could you have trusted God in the face of it as Daniel did? Would you have determined to continue to follow the Lord faithfully despite such dramatic transition in life? Daniel did. Daniel. What a man of faith. What a teenager of faith. Are you a person of faith, man or woman listening to me? The third thing that we see here in terms of these faith testers in Daniel's young life as a young teenager was this. Daniel was not only forcibly taken from his home, not only forcibly resettled in this foreign land, he was also forcibly indoctrinated by the hated rulers. He had no more freedom in his life to decide what he wanted to do with his life. Nobody came to Daniel and said, hey, what would you like to do when you grow up? It was all settled for him. The choices were out of his hands. And closely in keeping with that, let's remember Babylon is the hated oppressor of the Jews. Babylon's responsible for the destruction of the Jewish kingdom and for the death of many Jews. Daniel, now as a captive, controlled in Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar's thumb, he had no more ability to actively oppose the oppressor. He couldn't be part of a rebel movement within Judea. He's ripped out of all of that. And he's forced into a place where now his responsibility, the pressures on him, his responsibility was to help rather than hinder the hated enemy. Now that's pretty remarkable. Daniel's friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, later to be called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were forced, along with Daniel, into a 3-year training program. And I'm going to talk more about this, Lord willing, tomorrow. but they were forced into a 3-year training program that was designed to transform their worldviews, to transform their loyalties, to turn them into Babylonians rather than Jews. Now here's my question. As a young teenager, if that had happened to you and you were forced into these things, would you have stayed faithful? Would you have trusted God and determined to follow him despite such traumatic changes? Daniel did. Join me tomorrow as we continue to look at yet one more of these faith testers in Daniel's life along with his friends, and then what happened as a response to these tests of faith. Join me then, won't you? God bless.